Hi everyone, welcome back to more coverage of the cardiovascular system. In the previous lecture, we learned about the anatomy of the heart and just a little bit about what is happening inside the chambers and the great vessels of the heart, and that was laying the foundation for what we're going to be learning today, and that is the path of blood through the major circuits of the body. So, let's, as always, begin with our not really attendance questions. First, what do arteries do? Next, what lies between the left atrium and the left ventricle? And third, blood leaving the right ventricle travels towards what part of the body? Go ahead and pause the video, try to answer those. Hopefully you've done that, so let's see what the correct answers are. First, what do arteries do? We've talked about this several times now. Hopefully it's showing you that it is an important point, something that you're going to have to know on every exam. Remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart, and that is all. Anything else that arteries do, sometimes they do other things, sometimes they don't, but the one thing that all arteries do is carry blood away from the heart. Next, what lies between the left atrium and the left ventricle? So as you go from the atrium into the ventricle on either side of the heart, there is an AV valve or an atrioventricular valve. So on the left side of the heart is the left AV valve. That is the bicuspid valve, sometimes called the mitral valve. And third, blood leaving the right ventricle travels towards what part of the body? Blood leaving the right ventricle goes up into the pulmonary trunk, and it's headed towards the lungs. All right, so all three of those are going to be important today as we look at the path of blood. But first, let's learn some things about the very general paths of blood. There are two primary circuits in the body. Going from the heart to the lungs and back is called the pulmonary circuit, and going from the heart to the tissues and back is the systemic circuit. So, first let's look at the pulmonary circuit. When we look at the pulmonary circuit, really we're most concerned with the right side of the heart, because the right side of the heart is what sends blood to the lungs. Now the right side of the heart, here in this image we can see, is blue, and most models and books use blue to represent blood that is low in oxygen, or we call it deoxygenated blood. So the right side of the heart is deoxygenated. The left side of the heart, though, we can see it's red, and that's because it's high in oxygen, or we say it is oxygenated. The left side of the heart is red, it carries oxygenated blood. The right side of the heart is blue, it carries deoxygenated blood. So, looking at the pulmonary circuit, we're leaving the right side of the heart, going towards the lungs. Then we come back to the left side of the heart. During that time, we are oxygenating the blood. So we can say the pulmonary circuit flows from the right side of the heart to the lungs and back to the left side of the heart. Its purpose is to drop off carbon dioxide waste. When we breathe out and we breathe out carbon dioxide, that's because blood has delivered carbon dioxide waste from all over our body to our lungs so that we can breathe it out. So the function, again, drop off waste carbon dioxide to the lungs, but also pick up oxygen from the lungs. Pressure in the pulmonary circuit is pretty low because we're just going from the heart to the lungs and back. Well, the heart not in this image, but in reality, the heart sits right in between the right and the left lung. So it's a very short path from the heart to the lungs and back. Now, when we talk about the systemic circuit, it's going from the left side of the heart to the tissues throughout the entire body and back to the right side of the heart. Blood on the systemic circuit flows from the left side of the heart to the tissues of the entire body and back to the right side of the heart. The function of the systemic circuit is to deliver oxygen to the tissues of the body and pick up waste carbon dioxide. And we just keep going back and forth. Right side of the heart to the lungs and back, left side of the heart to the body and back. Delivering oxygen, picking up carbon dioxide, dropping off carbon dioxide and picking up oxygen. But if we look at the systemic circuit, well, again, the heart's right in between the lungs. Doesn't take a lot of pressure to get from the heart to the lungs and back, but it takes a whole lot of pressure to get, say, to the right foot and back. So anywhere that we're going from the heart to the body, that takes a lot of pressure. So the systemic circuit, the pressure is pretty high. And when you get your blood pressure taken, it really is talking about blood in the aorta, the pressure in the aorta, which is a part of the systemic circuit. This is just a very generalized diagram. Let's look at one that's a little bit more true, still not exactly true, but it shows more than just a very basic pulmonary circuit and a very basic systemic circuit. This is closer to the truth. We're going from the heart to the lungs and back. And then the systemic circuit, there's several different paths. Maybe we are going to parts of the upper body and back to the heart. Or maybe we are going to the digestive system through these tissues down here at the digestive system to the liver and back. Maybe we're just going straight to the liver and back. Maybe we're going to the kidneys and back. Or maybe we're going somewhere in the lower body and back. So the systemic circuit, there really are several different pathways. And even this does not adequately show all the different possible routes that the blood can take. This is just to show you that no, the systemic circuit is not just to the tissues and back. It's which tissues is it going to? We just really simplify it and say blood leaves the heart to go to the tissues of the body and back. But there is another part of the systemic circulation that was not on either of those images, and that's coronary circulation. This is the circulation to the heart itself. Now, it seems like all of that blood inside the heart, there's no need to deliver blood to the heart. But the reality is, all that blood inside the heart is not accessible by the heart. Blood flowing through the heart is just doing just that. It's flowing through the heart. It's not supplying the heart. Instead, as blood leaves the left ventricle into the aorta, some of it goes to the upper part of the body, some of it goes to the lower part of the body, some of it goes to those different things that we just looked at on that more detailed image. But some of it comes out of the aorta into some vessels on the surface of the heart itself. That is blood that is supplying nutrients and oxygen to the heart, specifically the heart muscle. So coronary circulation is delivering blood to the heart, and it is a part of the systemic circulation. In lab, we saw all those vessels spreading across the surface of the heart. That's the coronary circulation. And then once we've supplied blood to the heart, it needs to return. And it returns in a vein called the coronary sinus. And the coronary sinus returns blood from the heart into the right atrium, right next to where the superior vena cava enters the right atrium. Now, sometimes those vessels on the surface of the heart can get some blockage. And when that happens, all of a sudden we're not supplying oxygen to the heart as much as it needs. And the heart starts to get oxygen starved wherever that blockage happens to be. And remember, the heart is a muscle, and muscles, they need a lot of oxygen. What did we learn in Bio 137 when a muscle doesn't have enough oxygen? Well, when any tissue, but it's really prominent in muscle, when any tissue doesn't have enough oxygen, it can't perform cellular respiration. And instead, we only perform glycolysis. What happens when there's not enough oxygen for an extended period of time? Well, that glycolysis ends up producing lactic acid. So lactic acid builds up in tissues that are being starved of oxygen. In muscle that's being starved of oxygen, quite a bit of lactic acid can build up. And since it's an acid, well, what do you think of? If you were to spill acid on your skin, what do you think of? It would probably sting, it would burn. Well, the same thing happens in cardiac muscle when lactic acid builds up. But that pain doesn't feel like if you were to drop acid on your skin. It's more of a squeezing or crushing sensation is how your heart feels when it's in pain. And that is called angina pectoris. Angina pectoris. It's very similar to a heart attack, and actually a lot of cases where someone comes into the emergency room thinking they're having a heart attack, it is angina pectoris. The way to tell if it's angina pectoris is stop exerting yourself. Take a rest and see, does that pain subside? Does it go away when you're not stressing your heart and working out or doing something strenuous? If it does, that's angina pectoris. But angina pectoris is kind of a heads up, you're in danger of having a heart attack. Because if you are blocking the blood flow to the heart in some part of the heart, and lactic acid is building up and it's hurting and we're feeling angina pectoris, well, if that blockage gets any worse, we are going to completely block the blood flow to the heart. And even if you take a rest, even if you're not straining yourself, well, there's still not blood getting to that part of the heart. And any part of the body, if you deprive it of oxygen long enough, is going to die. Well, if you deprive a part of the heart long enough, that part of the heart is going to die, and that is a heart attack. A heart attack is what happens when a part of the heart is deprived of oxygen for an extended period of time, and that part of the heart dies. Well, the proper name for a heart attack is a myocardial infarction. Myocardial infarction, that is a heart attack. Okay, so we keep alluding to the path of blood, but now we are going to draw the path of blood. And I do recommend getting a blank sheet of paper, really more than I give you room for on your outline. Maybe use the back of your outline or something, because this is going to be not a super detailed picture, but it's going to be pretty spread out. So before we start actually drawing the path of blood, let's get our key going. So as I draw, red is going to represent blood that is high in oxygen, just like your book does, just like the models in the lab do. Red is high in oxygen. Red is oxygenated blood. Blue is low in oxygen. So anywhere where you see blue on my drawing, it's deoxygenated blood. But in a couple of spots, we're going to see mixed color. It's going to start out blue and end red, or it's going to start out red and end blue. When you see that, that represents spots in the body where the oxygen level is changing. Either we are taking deoxygenated blood and putting oxygen into it, or we're taking oxygenated blood and taking oxygen out of it. There's going to be a certain number of spots on the drawing where you see a square with some text inside of it. Square is going to represent a chamber of the heart. And if you see something written inside of a A circle is a valve in the heart that the blood is passing through. So that's the key for the drawing that we're going to use. Now, since really doesn't matter where we start, because as blood travels through the body, remember, it's just two big circles. You could almost think of it as a figure eight. Regardless of where you start, you are going to go through everything and end up back in the exact same spot. So it doesn't matter where you start. Arbitrarily, I am just picking to start at the right atrium. I could have started anywhere. We'll see at the very end what I mean by that. We could have started anywhere, but we are starting in the right atrium. And what we're going to be doing is tracing the path of a drop of blood through the entire body. If this drop of blood is in the right atrium, from there it's going to move through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. That is the path of a drop of blood through the right side of the heart from the right atrium to the right ventricle. It passes through the tricuspid valve. Then, when the heart beats, when the ventricles contract, blood in the right ventricle is going to move out of the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk, remember, exits the right ventricle. So blood just left the heart. So far, everything is blue because the blood in all of these areas is low in oxygen or deoxygenated. We're on our way towards the lungs. We started in the right atrium, passed through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The heart beats, squeezes the blood out of the right ventricle, through the pulmonary semilunar valve, into the pulmonary trunk, and we have left the heart. Now, immediately the pulmonary trunk splits into a right or left pulmonary artery. The right pulmonary artery goes towards the right lung. The left pulmonary artery goes towards the left lung. Make sure to keep that in mind if I were to ask you, how does blood get to the right lung? Well, it would go from the pulmonary trunk into the right pulmonary artery. Well, the pulmonary arteries, both the right and the left, are going towards the right or left lungs. So, right-left lungs or left-right lungs. Here we see that color change text. Blood arriving at either of the lungs is low in oxygen. But in the lungs, it becomes oxygenated. We drop off carbon dioxide, we pick up oxygen. That's what that color change means. Now, here, in reality, let me point out something that I have not written here. You won't be needing to know it on an exam, but I do want everyone to understand. We're leaving the heart. We're in the arteries, but what do arteries do? They branch and they get smaller. So the arteries, we're getting smaller arteries, smaller arteries, smaller arteries, until eventually we're in arterioles, and then we are in the capillaries of the lungs. We leave the lungs in the venules, and the venules join until we get to small veins, and then they join to get bigger and bigger and bigger veins. We're not going into that level of detail. We're saying we're going away from the heart in the arteries towards the lungs. So now we've oxygenated our blood. We're going to head back towards the heart. So how do we get back towards the heart? Well, that oxygenated blood is going to leave the lungs in either the right or left pulmonary veins, carrying oxygenated blood back towards the heart. The left and right pulmonary veins, what do? They empty blood into the left atrium. Blood entering the left atrium is going to pass through the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve into the left ventricle. When the heart beats, when it squeezes, blood is ejected out of the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. Now we've left the heart again. As we leave through the aorta, just like we saw with the lungs, smaller arteries, smaller arteries, smaller arteries until we're in arterioles, and then eventually we are in the capillaries at the tissues. So the aorta takes blood that is high in oxygen away from the heart towards the tissues of the body. Here at the tissues, blood is going to drop that oxygen off and pick up waste carbon dioxide. So the tissues, blood arriving is high in oxygen, blood leaving the tissues is low in oxygen. After we've done that, we leave the tissues, returning back to the heart, and depending on where in the body we're coming from, we're going to go into either the superior or inferior vena cava. The superior and inferior vena cava both empty into the right atrium. And now we're right back where we started. So what I meant when I said we could have started anywhere, I could have just as easily started in the left atrium instead of the right atrium. I could have started at the pulmonary semilunar valve. I could have started at the aorta. It doesn't matter because the entire thing is a circuit. On an exam, you can expect me to say, trace the path of a drop of blood from, and I will give you one of these locations. To, and I will give you one of these locations. And then you should be able to fill in everything in between. For example, I could say trace the path of a drop of blood from the bicuspid valve to the pulmonary trunk. Well, you would start with the bicuspid valve. You would go all this way until you get to the pulmonary trunk. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. Here, you do need to know where it is high in oxygen, where it is low in oxygen. Indicate if there are any spots where it changes from high to low or from low to high. We will possibly add a little onto this from endocrine. What do I mean by that? Well, as we are, let's say, in the left atrium through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle to the aortic semilunar valve to the aorta, well, what if we're going to go and pick up some ADH? Where do we go from the aorta? Remember the path of blood through the posterior pituitary? That's where we pick up ADH. Or if we were going to pick up FSH, well, that's from the anterior pituitary. Then we come back until we're in the superior vena cava into the right atrium. Path of blood grows constantly. I could also say, well, trace the path of a drop of blood from the left ventricle to the tissue of the right arm. And at the tissue of the right arm, the liquid that is not reabsorbed, trace that back to the tricuspid valve. Well, now we've got to go through the lymph system until we get back to the vena cava and then to the tricuspid valve. The path of blood is extremely extensive. And I know right now every single student is sitting there staring at their computer, either cursing me or rubbing their temples or shaking their head. I promise, if you are going into nursing, or if you are going into respiratory therapy, or if you are going into dental programs, all of these things, Even a lot of this is covered in radiography. This does come back. I have never had a single student tell me, I wish you didn't make me learn path of blood. But I have had a lot of students come back and tell me they are glad that they learned path of blood because it came in handy in their program. So I do understand that this is asking a lot, but I promise it will be worth it in the long run. So that is where we will stop today. Relatively short lecture, but there was a lot going on in that lecture. As you study, the best thing to do there is just write that path of blood over and over and over again, starting and stopping in different points. Use that one drawing that shows everything as your key. On another piece of paper, say, I'm going to start here and stop there. Fill it in and then check it against your key. All right. Take care. Don't hate me too badly, and I will talk to you next time.